Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine Podcast Radio. You're about to listen to an episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. Do you follow the pack or challenge the status quo? Join Ted as he explores how to succeed by going against conventional wisdom. You'll hear leaders in technology and security tell stories about how they achieve their success by doing things differently. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Tech Done Different. As always, I'm your host, Ted Harrington. And with me here today is our special guest, Jack Leidecker, the CISO of Gong. Jack, thanks for joining the show, man.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Cool. Well, let's dive right in, because I think that what you do every day has insights that many of the people who listen to our show are probably really thirsting for. And it's essentially this question that, you are the security leader of a company that's fully cloud. And there's probably plenty of people listening to this saying, how do we do that? So I know that's a big question, obviously. So pick whatever aspect of it you want to start with. But for people who are saying, like, how do I build a cloud-based company and do it securely? Where should they start?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll love to speak about that a little bit. I think one of the big things that you see that happens a lot is, what type of cloud company are you, right? And the reason why I say that, I've been at a lot of different companies. If you're dealing with a lift and shift where it's more traditional infrastructure and I just happen to host it in AWS or Google, that's one thing. What I'll really talk about more is, if you're a cloud company, how are you actually taking advantage of cloud, right? Like, are my instances ephemeral? Am I trying to patch an AMI versus just spinning up something new and then hooking into a data source? So I think that's one of the big areas of making sure you can kind of align on first of, what are we trying to do? How can we automate? This is, I think, one of the areas where it gets a little bit more challenging is, if you're trying to do things manually, you're probably not doing it very cloudy. Even for us, because we'll use things like CIS hardened AMIs, that makes it a lot easier, right? We know what the baseline is, we know what it's going to be doing. And then I think the other big aspect is making sure you have the right capability to be able to analyze all the data. The good and the bad with the cloud is you don't have your regular network traffic, but you do have VPC flow and even VPC mirroring. But those can be very noisy, right? So making sure you're set up correctly to be able to actually analyze all that data so you know what's happening with it, and then automate is the other key aspect I would say to focus on.
So that capability that you're mentioning, is that when you use that term, are you saying that we need to have a person, like that's the capability, or is it the person that we have has to have that skill? Or are we saying that we have to have a tool, or is it a combination of the things? What does capability mean in that context?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it depends on which cloud you're talking about. But either way, it's making sure you actually have the right things turned on, right? If you're dealing with AWS, there's a lot of capabilities you can do, but they don't necessarily come turned on by default, right? You have to enable guard duty. You have to turn on things like VPC flow. And then you need to figure out, where is that data going and how can I process it, right? So you need to be able to have tools to be able to do that. If you're just in one cloud, I would say probably the easiest way to start is using what tools are there. If you're dealing with multiple clouds, which I've had to do in the past, then you're looking at some sort of aggregation, right? How am I pulling that data together? How can I do data stitching? So yes, you still need a person to be able to look at it to some extent. But if you don't have a system, or if I'm not capturing the data, I could have a team of 50 people and it wouldn't make any difference. I need to be able to have the data to be able to look through too.
Interesting. Yeah, this angle to the problem of having, we have to have the tools doing the right things to help us achieve the goal, but then also having the people who know how to run the tools. I'm curious your take on this, because one of the challenges that I've seen happen at a lot of companies, cloud or not, is that there's the siren song of a tool that will solve all my problems, right? Like, walk around the expo floor at RSA and there's no shortage of promises that this solves your problem, right? And the challenge, though, is once you buy this tool, now someone needs to run it, respond to it, be trained in it. How do you see, I guess two questions. So first, you also see that? And two, if so, how do you think that we deal with that? How do we fix that problem?
Yeah, no, that actually is a common problem, right? Everyone has a new tool. I could have 50 different tools, but nobody knows what to do with them. I think the biggest thing there, though, is, to your point, you have to have someone that can tune and maintain that tool. Otherwise, you shouldn't be buying it. Like, what am I getting? Is it making things less complex or more complex? I would say there's still some kind of baseline things that I would expect, which is, can I process log data? I know I was focusing on that, but to me, even for a company like Gong, even though we have, I don't know, probably around 600 people or so, we're closing in on 2 terabytes of data a day, right? So that alone means I need a way to be able to process that, which is not necessarily as simple as it would be if I was on-prem. But there's not one tool that's going to fix everything, right? I would say even if you look at cloud security, there's lots of consolidation happening all the time. If you went on the RSA floor 3 years ago, probably about half those companies have been acquired, in some cases acquired more than once. That's not really the right answer. It's more of, what are we trying to do from a risk mitigation perspective? And do I have enough visibility across that to be able to do that? And then how do my tools fit within it? And how do my people manage those tools and be able to get the value out of it? It doesn't do you any good if you're just buying the nice shiny object if you're not going to maintain it and use it.
Got it. So in a sense, part of what we're talking about here is really part of leadership principles or the leadership challenge. And so as you look across your organization, what would you say are, if any, are the biggest differences between being a security leader like yourself versus someone who leads different parts of the company? Like how is your challenge different from the CEO or the CMO or any of the other members of the C-suite?
So I think in some cases, that's probably a bad way to look at it. And the reason why I'd actually say that is there's technical components of the job that are going to be different, right? What am I doing to secure, and specifically how my team is doing it is going to be different than what the other leaders are looking at. However, I would say if you're a leader in a company, your goal should be the same, right? What am I doing and how is my team helping our business grow? Are we increasing friction into our company, or are we actually making things go faster? I think this kind of goes even into your initial part of, if you're in a cloud company, how are you able to do this? What is security doing in terms of automation and making this easier, both from let's say a customer perspective, right? Because we're a B2B company. So I think that's actually easier for me to align to, which is part of the reason why I picked Gong. If not one of the main reasons is our customers are wanting us to do a lot of things, right? How are we making sure we're doing that in an automated manner up to the level that's expected? So it's not creating friction within that sales cycle, but then even internally, how are we doing things where it's more automated, right? I don't like doing a lot of manual reviews. What can we automate? What's configured on the back end? What can we check within AWS? Because we are an AWS company. There's a lot of stuff we can do on our own where I don't have to send a request over to DevOps. Hey, I need you to validate this, right? We should be able to pull that data ourselves and see what's happening. So it's easier for them when we deal with compliance, but then it's also better for us because we know exactly what's happening and we can react accordingly.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, you're talking about this idea of, how can security support the business? And in a lot of times that connection isn't always made. So, this idea of using security as a business driver, I've heard you say automation certainly is a key thing. How do we reduce friction, et cetera? How would you best define the advantage that security delivers to a company?
So I think the first part is understanding the company, right? Because what security does for each company is not necessarily always going to be the same. Not to say that it's necessarily going to be bad or good at a different one, but you need to understand the business, right? And this is why, kind of going back to even that initial leader part, what's different between you and some of the other ones, I need to understand, one, how do we make money? What are our customers looking for? And then how is security a part of that? Same thing if you're looking at what is marketing doing to make the brand more aware? How is HR bringing in the right people and helping through that process? We should be no different in that regards, right? How are we actually making sure security is securing the type of data we have, right? We take a lot of data in, so there's a lot of risk there. But our customers also want us to be able to get that data because we can provide more value. So from that perspective, building up a program where they get comfortable with what we're doing, and we should be doing more than they expect from my perspective, makes that easier, right? So especially if you look at it from even a competitive standpoint, because we're growing really quickly, it's easier for us to do this than maybe some other companies. We can put in a lot of maturity quicker than I would say some other ones. And that, I think, is to your question, how is security looking at helping speed that up? It's making sure we have the right level on it, but it's also understanding the business, even going back into really quickly. I started in security more in like pen testing back in the day, right? I know we initially kind of talked about some of that and everything else. But one of the things I noticed really quickly is there's a huge disconnect, right? If I'm only technical when I'm speaking to senior leadership, it's not going to make a lot of sense to them, nor should we expect them to have to understand us, which I think sometimes is a problem that you see in security. It's like, well, They should just know, they should get it, right? This should be really apparent. Of course we have to do this, and this is why. If we're not able to relate it back to the business terms, we're not really meeting the intent of what you should be doing, which is why I even went back and like got my MBA and everything else. Is I saw that disconnect and I wasn't really sure why. But in order to really enable the business, I need to understand the business and then align what we're doing and how we're actually helping there.
You're absolutely hitting the like center of maybe not a nerve, but a real challenge that I see across all industries, all companies, that there is this disconnect between the business and the technical. And it's not even because the technical people don't care about the business. It's just like that wasn't part of what they were trained to do. So now that you've sort of had that moment of self-awareness and went to go learn some things and got a degree and everything, what are the couple things that you learned in that process that other people can emulate? Like they might not have the resources or the time or interest in getting an MBA, but maybe there's like a couple things they could go study today.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And it'll probably seem like a theme here. Understand the business, right? Every business is a little bit different, understanding what their drivers are. So if you understand where security could be impacted or not, like let's say, hey, if I'm in manufacturing, understanding my skate environment is going to be a lot more relevant than a cloud company. But what's the impact if something goes wrong? What's the impact if something goes well? What type of customers do we have? Just being able to align what you're doing to them is what's going to really help. What typically doesn't help though, and this is where I've seen a lot of challenges in the past as well, is if I push it and it's just like, well, management just doesn't get security, right? I hear that all the time. I'm sure you've heard it too. Like they just don't get it. They're just not the right place. And is it really that they don't get it, or we're speaking two different languages and it should really be on them to understand it? Or should it be us as the subject matter experts in security to help translate it into more of a common vernacular, right? How are we talking about the different issues that we're dealing with, and how are we making sure we're actually fixing them, right? Now, are we moving down the path, right? I think that's the other aspect when you're talking about what should you think about. How do I make sure that I'm not selling FUD, because that typically doesn't work well? But then also, how do I explain this is a journey, right? You don't have a security project and hey, we're done after a year and then you never do anything, right? Security is you're having to constantly improve. You have to change based on threats, what's happening with it, even making sure you didn't miss something, because it only takes kind of a bad actor, one mistake to be able to come in. So you have to continue to improve, that you're clear in expressing that, right? It's not all right, hey, I got all this funding, I did all these different things. And I actually even had a peer years ago where it's like, after a breach, guess what? They got like $10 million and burned through that in like 3 months, but they didn't actually end up deploying anything or doing anything with it. So then when it went time to go back to the board, they're like, hey, are we better or worse? And it's like, well, we think we have a roadmap now, but we didn't actually fix anything. And that wasn't very well received. So that's kind of one of those of just being aware of, if you're not getting the visibility that you want, is it because they don't understand? Is there some alignment? Is there other business challenges that maybe take away from what's happening? How do you understand what's happening so that way you can better express what you're doing and how that actually relates back to the business? And that I would say doesn't take a degree, right? It's more of like, what are we doing and how are we actually doing it?
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And man, what a squandered opportunity that you just mentioned, where it's like a breach, bad thing happens, that sucks. But then resources become available. That's great. And what a great opportunity to say, here's an opportunity to level up. And maybe the business experience after that of like, well, do we need to spend money on this? Because if the money's not going to be actually making us better, what are we doing? Is that essentially what happened?
Yeah, I think they still did it. I think it was more of a, hey, you spent all this, but you're not able to actually show me what we're doing. But you see it all the time, right? Where it's like, hey, there's a big impact after this breach, and then we're going to do it, and then we're not. A lot of that is, how are we articulating the impact of what happened, and how are we showing that we're going to be better from it? And then in some cases, if you're not able to articulate that, or let's say that the business alignment isn't there, why would they want to spend money, right? If they think that they're just going to get breached again and, hey, I can throw in 50 million and the exact same thing can happen in a year. Honestly, from a business decision, it makes sense probably not to worry about dealing with it. As sad as that is, but that means we're not actually showing how we're reducing risk in that regard any longer.
Totally agree. So how do we show that we're reducing risk? How do we measure a negative? Like, we didn't get hacked, so is what we're doing working? Like, how do you go about measuring it?
Measuring whether you got hacked is, you can never win, right? You see with everything that happens, it just takes one thing. I think the bigger thing is more showing, how are you progressing with your journey, right? Do you have a journey and a maturity that you're trying to go for? What are some of the risk areas that you know that you're actively taking, right? you can't reduce risk to zero. But security's job, just like business job, even I think a good example is if you look at board of directors. Sometimes security people think, hey, I'm going to the board of directors to get money. No, you're not. You're more to let them know that you have it handled and they understand what's going on. But the reason why I like using that example is their job is to help the company understand what type of risk they're taking from a company perspective, right? Hey, we're thinking about new markets. We're doing different things. They're providing some corporate oversight, and that's where you get audit committees and everything else, right? Their job there isn't to say that we're not going to have any. But sometimes I think in security, we almost want to take the absolute stance of, yeah, we want to get to zero. Well, we never really want to get to zero, but I need to make sure that the risk is visible. So whether you're looking at things more like resiliency or what are we doing to prevent and how are we able to do that? And again, kind of, can I align what we're doing back to the business? I would say, I think for me, I took the easy way out in this regards. In a B2B company that's cloud where we're taking data, I can show if our customers are coming on because of some of the things that we're doing, or in some cases because of what we're not. And conversely, are they actually integrating with everything we want to? If they're not, why not? Are they not comfortable with the security? Are those things we want to be able to fix? So they can, because the more that we do that and that they feel secure with our approach and our controls, the more value we're able to provide them as well. So mine's maybe a little bit easier, but I think overall it's kind of aligning it back to the business as well.
So it's an interesting scenario where the customer either expresses one way or another, either explicitly or implicitly, that they are or are not comfortable with your security. So how does that, from your side, how does that actually play out? So a customer says, hey, I'm not quite sure if I'm ready to proceed with, subscribing or getting a license or whatever. Then what? How do you assure them that, hey, it's going to be okay?
Yeah, that's a fun question, right? I think some of it depends on the customer. Right, kind of the same thing. And this is, and actually, it made me think of maybe an easier way to talk about one of the things that I really liked, and I think helps even more than maybe some of the education. I love Simon Sinek. Start with why. It is a really good, simple kind of concept to think about. Same thing here, right? What is the reason that they're concerned about, right? Is it GDPR? Is it right to be forgotten? Is it just more of they have customer obligations, or they're just concerned about having themselves in the news, right? How do you understand what their pain points are, and how do we have the right program that helps address that or not? I think one of the aspects that was kind of nice, even though I haven't been there quite 6 months yet, but we already had a lot of certifications, right? So that was kind of your table stakes. And I'm not the one to say that, hey, I think a certification, whether it's personal or company, means that you're completely secure. By no means, right? If anything, you can look at my wall and I'll have fun joking about some of them. But it does give you an idea, hey, at least a company's thinking about it, right? How are we showing we're doing privacy by design? We've built a lot of product functionality and features into showing how we can make sure you're maintaining, and in some cases, even increasing what you're doing from a compliance and security perspective. I think that's one of the big aspects, but it tends to be a discussion, right? Every place is doing different third-party risk management now. Sometimes it may be an architecture review. Sometimes it may be a questionnaire, but in the end, it gets down into what's their pain points. Are we able to solve them correctly or not? And then how are we able to show them how we're even getting better on top of that?
Oh, I mean, everything about that answer I loved, but the way that you ended it, how do we get better? I mean, that's the core of security, right? How do we get better? And as simplified as that sounds, that to me is how you can really differentiate the companies who are doing security right versus the ones who are sort of seeing it more as an exercise in checking boxes. Because the ones who talk about hey, here's what we're doing to get better. Here's how we're better today than yesterday. Here's how we're going to be better, 6, 12, 18 months from now. I think that's the heart of it, right? Security is you're never completely secure, but you can be better.
Mm-hmm. You can always improve, right? Continuous improvement, even if you look at how people are trying to integrate more into DevOps, everything's around continuous improvement. And as you mentioned, if you stand still in security, I think that's the only reason why I've been able to be in security as long as I have, is you never get bored, right? What worked now isn't going to work later. And you can always do things better, more efficient. What are we doing with that? And making sure that you're not losing track of that, which I think even goes back into setting expectations, right? Security is not a destination, it's a journey, right? How are we doing more? If things come out differently, how do we help mitigate that? And how are we staying on top of it is really key, I think, in order to have any sort of longevity. Because if I think that, all right, hey, even if I have an unlimited budget for a certain time period, that needs to continue, right? You can't just stop hey, we did good enough, because compliance, again, to me is kind of a means. If you're doing good security, compliance comes really easily, but you've seen the inverse a lot, unfortunately, where you think you have good security because you have compliance, but you're really doing more compliance theater versus the security in the back end, which is for me a really big aspect. Even when I came to Gong, that I actually had some pretty interesting conversations of making sure, where do we want to be? And in some cases that may not work for every company. Partially, I think in a lot of the cases, it's just not articulated well, not that they don't want to do it. They just don't understand why that's important, but really making sure, how do we want to do things, right? Because just because I passed an audit doesn't mean we're where we need to be. We know there's improvements. How do we make sure we know what those areas are and we're continuing to focus on them so we're not staying still and becoming stagnant?
Yeah, totally agree with you on that. So let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about, so your name is maybe, it doesn't sound like your heritage. And you and I were talking about that the other day about how that's kind of like, maybe you're social engineering people. You're like sneaking in some sort of, so tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a funny thing. And ironically, I almost hate to even just mention this, but I think even my company, because I have a big focus on like diversity and equity, helped highlight in some cases things I don't always think about. When I was growing up, my mom, who's actually from Honduras, so I'm technically a first generation immigrant on my mom's side, which you would never guess from my name, didn't want me to know Spanish. Didn't want me to actually even show that I had any Honduran anything, which I think was kind of sad in a way, but I understand kind of why she did that, because to your point, hey, am I in disguise or things like that? Because there was a concern if there's a perception of, okay, hey, if you're not fitting the exact mold as someone else, or what are you going to be doing there? How is that going to affect you? Which I never even really thought about. I just thought it was kind of weird. But if I kind of go back to my mom, which I think is kind of interesting too, she was the first of 16 kids that moved from Honduras, actually as a nun. So I like joking around with people that I'm the son of a nun. She was out of the nunnery for a while, but it's still a really fun story. She hates it, which probably makes it even more entertaining for me in that regards. But she came from a place where she was the first out of 16 and only 8 survived past 5. So not, hey, her mom was pregnant 16 times. She was actually pregnant even more than that, but 8 actually made it past 5, which is kind of a weird situation if you think about. But if you look at kind of what's representation in some of the areas, I think even some of the things I've gotten from people getting more in the industry recently, it's like, hey, we just don't see people of our color or different things that are in there. And in some cases, maybe we are. And like me, I was kind of in hiding, right? But how do we make sure that we're talking about them more? And how can that be a benefit, right? Because I think even as I've built teams over the years, the more diverse the team is, typically the better it's been, without question. Like if everyone's kind of the same, regardless of whether that same is, you end up starting to get groupthink and other things, which I think is horrible. Even on my team, I'll come up with ideas. I even tell them like, hey, look, if I'm the only one and everybody agrees, it's probably a pretty bad idea. And I'm aware of that. Like we should be talking about and figuring out what's going to make the most sense, because you only have one perspective. So how do you make sure you get all those different perspectives?
So now that you've sort of recognized maybe some of that, I guess, I don't know if dissonance is the right word there, but have you found that it has like uncovered the community that you're now a part of? And do you find that you're able to sort of have a louder voice, louder megaphone for that community?
I feel like it's one I can probably do more on, actually, which is kind of one of the ones. It's like, how do you make sure to get involved? I think I'm trying to do what I can even at my company, or even talking about it more. I think some of the feedback, even just talking about it, can help. I feel like there's probably more. I mean, I actually was, even when I was younger, part of like the HACU, which was the Hispanic Association of College and Universities back in like 99. Nice. But it's how do you stay involved and how do you continue to talk about that? I think there is communities that you run into more. And I would say a lot of my friends actually end up in that area, and other different ones too. But just being able to kind of highlight, hey, there is people of this in our industry that isn't always as apparent. That alone, I think, is kind of helpful. But I think to your point, I think there's probably quite a bit more I can still do. And I'm trying to figure out even what should I be doing in that regards, because I also don't want to feel disingenuous with it either, right? Like my Spanish is horrible. Like it's really, really bad. And on top of, to make it even worse, like my mom became a Spanish teacher when I was in high school. I'm like, seriously, like it's bad enough that I didn't know it, but now you're even teaching kids, and my Spanish is bad. So like with like my daughter, when she visits, she's not allowed to speak English to try and help not create the same thing in that regards. But I think it's a process, and it's kind of the same thing when I'm looking at security. It's a journey, right? Like what can I do to even talk about it more? Like you said, you and I talked about it, but honestly, what do I do with that? I think I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's certainly the first step, right? Is asking the question, what more can we do? How can we do this better? And, when I look at our company at ISE, it's, statistically, we are ahead of like every diversity metric that there is. Like quantifiably, if the stat is like X, we're above X.
Sure.
But nevertheless, and that's relative to the security community, but the security community isn't as diverse as other industries. So even though we're ahead of the norm, we're still like, there's ways to go. What are things we can do? And I don't know the answer to how we can foster diversity, but I so strongly agree with you that diversity of viewpoints, diversity of ideas, which isn't even that's not even a question about ethnicity. That's just, how do we make sure that we get different people who think differently to challenge each other, right?
Yeah. How can you have kind of an open discussion around different viewpoints, right? Regardless of what it is, everyone has different experiences, and how do you create an environment where it's there? And I think, to your question, or even around like diversity and how do we do more with that? I know my company's been doing a lot of research on that too. Like, hey, you can't just prepare for when you're where you want to be. It's how do you make sure that you have the right support mechanisms? So if you do get people, they feel supported, because I think that's one of the biggest things that you've noticed across the board, that if people don't feel supported, they're not going to necessarily stay, right? So it helps from, I think, even a stickiness perspective, but even a growing perspective, and understanding what's happening is, okay, how do we reach out to different communities, right? How do we make sure that there's some different opportunities there? I think security is actually one of the areas where it's a little bit helpful in terms of, everyone loves talking about the employment shortage, right? But then it's like, okay, what are we doing to help fix that? Do we really need someone that needs this? And I think, especially, I don't know, I almost feel like I've been in the security too long, but like someone coming out of a security boot camp probably has a lot less value to me than someone that like did something on their own, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, did you go and do a capture the flag? Did you do some other labs yourself? Like, what did you actually do? Or maybe you don't have the exact experience, but you can show me that you have those skills, right? How are you curious? Because even I would say for any security cert, okay, the second you take it, it's already starting to get stale, right? We already talked about continuous improvement. I think security is one of those areas too, where it's like, do I really need someone that fits this exact mold? Or I actually probably want someone that's a little bit different, but they're analytical, they're curious, they want to dig into things. I mean, even the way I got in security, I think was completely fluky, where I thought I was going to be more in business and ended up figuring out, hey, I can break a website and then figure out how to fix it, and I can get paid for that. This actually seems kind of fun for me. Like, there wasn't any specific reason behind it besides, like I said, it's just something I stumbled into, but because it was so vast, was really interesting to me, right? And I continued to go with that, where if it was stuck of, well, I really wanted someone that did this, I probably would have never got that chance. And I think sometimes we forget about how a lot of the people that have been in security for 20 years started, that we get into this sort of like, well, no, you need to do this, or I have an entry-level position that wants 3 years of experience. It's like, well, it's not entry-level then, right? Like, you can't be entry-level and need all this experience. Or, for a SOC analyst, I want a CISSP. It's like, well, why, right? Like, I have a love-hate relationship with the CISSP. Mainly, I've had it, actually, I think I'm hitting my 20-year anniversary, which is sad in a way. But it was a management cert. Really good high level one. Like, I loved it when I was doing even work with accounting. It's like, hey, partners need to do that so they understand the concept, but it wasn't meant to be a technical cert, right? Now it's evolved a little bit and gone back and forth, but like, never in my wildest dreams would I have ever imagined that I would want like an initial SOC analyst coming out of school doing a CISSP. Like, I don't see a big benefit there, but you see that a lot in our industry, which I think is kind of making it more complicated to create the type of people we need to fill in all those gaps, right? Because if we can't actually start building people at a lower level, they're never going to get to the level that we want them later on for engineers and other work.
Yeah, I love it. So I have this idea. I'd love you to either validate or poke all the holes in it.
Sure.
So when people ask me that question, that it sounds like, you're getting a bit too, which is like, okay, well, what should I do to enter a career in security? And the way people usually almost always ask the question is one of two ways. They're either saying, what cert should I get? Or what courses should I take in order to get a class in security? So I'll directly answer those questions. But then here's the idea that I often throw out, and people's eyes kind of glaze over and they're like, oh my God, that sounds terrifying. What I suggest is I say, do some security research. And the reason that I think you should do security research is the outcome almost doesn't matter. Because if you go through the process of saying, hey, I've come up with a hypothesis, I'm going to go evaluate the hypothesis. And if I succeed in being able to do that, and then I have some findings, wow, I have something to talk about. Now I can bring it to the press. And in an interview, I can talk about this project I created. But even if you fail, you now realize, oh, well, what was wrong with the hypothesis? What was wrong with my approach? What skills do I need to develop? And in an interview, talking about those things is so powerful to the person interviewing you. That's what I am recommending to people, in addition to the things you mentioned, capture the flags and labs. Do you think what's your reaction to that? Is that like, am I crazy to suggest that to people?
I think it depends on what they want to do. And honestly, I think that's probably maybe the first part to start off with is, what about security is interesting to them, right? And it's a hard thing to say if you haven't done it, because security is kind of across the board on so many different things these days. Right? It's not just the pen testing. It's not just security research. Do I like defense? Do I like breaking things more? Do I love coding? Right? Is there something that I like to do that I can double down in and then start relating it to security? It is to me. But if it is, hey, I want to get into, even if it's into SOC work, right? The fact that I was able to try and do some research and do that shows some of those analytical skills that I think can be helpful. I would actually probably maybe take it to a different way, where I've seen a lot of people be more successful recently too, is see what communities you can get involved in. The more community involvement, I mean, shoot, that's what worked for me almost 25 years ago. And I see some people doing that who are more active and even asking for help and asking about different things, whether it's on LinkedIn, whether it's on something else. Conferences have gotten really big now. But I remember back in the day, that was the whole point for me of like DEF CON, right? Hey, we're trying to figure out what we're doing, who wants to do stuff. I was probably one of the ones that said, I sold out immediately because this is fun and I don't want to do something else and do this on the side, right? This is what I want to do as my career. So even talking with people over the years of, hey, how do I break into that? Or I've done security research and I want to do this. Or I've even ran into one where they did security research, but they love compliance for some reason, right? They really like to be able to do some validation. They thought it was fun to do with Otter. I'm like, hey, great. Then look at doing this a little bit differently. So I guess my main point with that is, I think what you're saying is actually good, but it depends on what they want to do. And there's lots of different things you can do. And the biggest thing is just figuring out, what is my goal and what do I need to get there, which is going to be a combination of different things. But either way, if you're able to find something and actually break it, and hey, you can get to the press and everything else, that is kind of a shortcut in some cases to be able to get your name out there. But if I'm not a super technical coder, but I still would be good on a lot of the analytical stuff, that may not work as well for me. So that would be the only kind of caution part I would put with it, is just making sure that it's something you can do, or if you can't or you don't want to, figure out something else. But I think there's lots of opportunities, even whether it's volunteering, get involved in different areas. You can definitely get your name out there and start working through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, but you can do research that isn't just breaking things, right?
Absolutely.
Like if you're an analytical person, you could study, like, here's the data set, and what can I get out of that data set, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be like a research project though, too, right? And I guess this is, again, to me, kind of goes into what are you trying to get from it? If you're talking about in an interview, how you can explain that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just think it's more of a, what am I trying to get out of it? And is it matching what's happening with it, right? Like,
yeah.
Because what you don't want to do, and this is my only kind of caution with that, it's like, oh, hey, I'm going to analyze what I think people need to do for GDPR, but I have no background in privacy, right? I have no background in this part. And I'm going to come up with this great thing that I think is awesome. I'm going to try and talk about it. If it ends up being all wrong, it still helps you that you kind of looked at it, but it's like, you need to make sure that you understand what you're trying to do, and you don't just have it so open-ended that you don't know how you can validate, which to me kind of goes back even into the community part, where if you are working with someone that's helping you through that, and you can bounce ideas off, like, hey, I'm thinking about this. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Or, hey, if you can figure out how this works, awesome, right? Versus hey, I'm just gonna go off on my own and do it. And I come up with this great thesis that I came up with, but I forgot some of the dependencies because I've never done this before. And I just wasted 50 hours for nothing. That's the only reason why I'd be putting pushback. Beyond the fact, I just think I didn't want to agree.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because now it's almost like we're talking about pairing a couple ideas. One is like, go do something more than just like get a cert.
Yep.
But then also find yourself someone, some resource, some mentor, someone who can kind of help validate your growth. Because yeah, without guidance, who knows if we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I would say so, for sure. I think having some of that guidance is helpful. And I would say, When you do that, though, because I see this happen sometimes too, make sure you understand what you want from that guidance. Because what you don't want to do is be like, hey, I'm throwing myself on LinkedIn. I need a mentor.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, what does that mean? And also, you still need to take accountability for what you want to do. Like, I've had a lot of people I've tried to help over the years. And then I've had some where I'm just like, you know what you're doing. I don't know how I'm supposed to help you. Like, I can't create this for you. Like, you need to tell me what your passion is, what you want to do. And I'm happy to tell you what to go focus on. But if you're expecting me to give you a roadmap of how you're going to get from SOC analyst to, let's say, CISO, for example, that one is a pretty long journey. But then two is like, why is that? What do you really want to do? Is it more you want to get into management? You want to get into leadership? You want to understand how you're reducing risk? Like, you need to understand as well a little bit what you want to focus on, which is where, again, like I said, I think security is fun because there's so much. Do a little research, understand what day-to-days are a little bit, figure out what you want to focus on first, try that. What you started with, you may not end up with, but at least that way it gives you an idea of what you're looking for. So you don't go for a mentor without some defined criteria, because if you get too demanding or it's too vague, the problem you'll have is a lot of people just kind of fade away, and then you're not getting what you want out of it either.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the mentor ask is a scary one, right? Asking someone to mentor you, but then people, like in my life, I can't remember anybody who taught me how to ask a mentor. I just kind of had to like figure it out. Be like, well, this person's really busy. Maybe they can only answer one question at a time. And it turns out in hindsight, that's actually what you should do. You should, the way you get a mentor is you start really small. Like, I have this very specific thing. Can you give me advice on this one idea? And then as you build trust over time, that person maybe becomes more involved in what you're trying to do. So yeah, no, I agree. I think all the insights you've shared today are going to absolutely help people who are, trying to establish their careers in security. So that's awesome, man.
Yeah. Well, and even if you look at, kind of a sad part, just to say it anyhow, since it happened, but like Dan Kaminsky, who just passed away, who was actually around my age, which scares me a little bit too, regardless whether there's health complications or not. You could always ask him a question, right? Like, if you think about the old days at Econ, anybody just asked stuff, right? And for me, I think that's the part where, how can you start small, build up some credibility before you try and get too much of a big ask, right? Just have a quick discussion. Hey, saw your talk, or I saw this. What about this? How do you talk about different things? I think that community is still well and alive in that regards. But the main reason why you just bring up his name, people didn't talk about all the technical stuff he did. Like, almost all the things I saw over the weekend were around like, oh yeah, I remember when I talked with him and we had this great discussion. It was always like down to earth. And I think to me, that's really what you want to be, right? How are you able to help with it? And don't be afraid, because most people that have been in this, and there's always going to be exceptions, right? We love to talk about what we do. Like, I love talking about security. Security is the most fun thing for me to probably talk about. And I've never been like, no, I can't just talk about this or talk about that. Even the fact, like, I take great pride, total sidebar, but for some reason I feel like this is so relevant in this case. I can't say how proud I was when my daughter decided to pick security awareness for like her third grade class. Like, that was just the most exciting thing for me. And I'm like, oh, I've corrupted another one that's getting the bug that she wanted to talk about, like malware and things like that. Like, to me, I think that's what we want to do, right? Because security is really a community game. It's not a one person versus this. It's how do we improve each other? And there is a community there. So how do you become a bigger part of it? And that will help you with your career as well.
I love it. Yeah. What a great way to honor Dan and the contributions that he made, and to tie it back to what security is about, a community. That's powerful stuff. What a great way to wrap up our episode here. As we conclude, Jack, any last parting words or wisdom that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think whether it's, again, just to kind of summarize, if you're trying to break into security, spend some time yourself, figure out what you want to do. And I think there's lots of opportunities to do that. And then second, if you are in security and you're running into the challenges or you're not able to communicate with the business, understand your business, right? Whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. The more you understand your business, the easier it is for you to be able to relate to what their pain points are and how security is going to relate.
Well, thanks for sharing all the wisdom, man. This is, I think people are going to learn a lot, I got a lot out of chatting with you today. So that's my barometer of like, yes, that was good.
Awesome.
Awesome. All right. So for everybody listening, if you want to learn more about what Jack is up to or to request to appear on the podcast yourself, just head over to tedharrington.com/podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Tech Done Different podcast with Ted Harrington. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.